My name is Dr. Brock Eubanks. I teach macro and microeconomics here at YVCC, and I also teach small business management.
As a country, how are we not living within our means?
I think we can approach answers to these questions using the way we break down economics theoretically. We have the micro view, which focuses on individuals and their behavior. We're talking either individuals, businesses, markets, or industries. We also have the macro view, which takes into consideration the economy as a whole. The way I think about it macroeconomically, if you look at the magnitude of the Great Recession, we have a lot of debt accumulated, not just fiscal debt, government debt, but personal debt, individual debt. And when we look at the aggregate of all that debt, I would argue that we're not living within our means. Before the Great Recession, we had a pretty high propensity to individually spend on credit. So we had credit cards, we had home mortgages, second mortgages, third mortgages that we took out in order to spend more money. And so the recession is sort of that self-correcting mechanism that allows us to take the time, recoup our losses, pay down our debt in order to get ready to start spending again. That's the macroeconomic perspective. The government, on the other hand, continues to escalate its debt. And so with respect to this notion of living within its means, they're sort of, from a policy perspective, exempt from that because their goal is to keep the economy at what we call full employment. So their job is to make sure that the inflation rate doesn't get out of control, which affects price level. Okay, so keep prices under control, keep employment under control. So put people back to work, lower the unemployment rate, keep the unemployment rate stable, as well as increase real GDP, so grow the economy. So with respect to this notion of living within its means, the government is sort of exempt from that, and their goal is to make sure that the economy is steered toward this full employment perspective. Now, from a micro perspective, we have a lot of people who are living beyond their means. You have credit cards, you have loans that need to be paid off. And so what we need to be concerned with there is the relationship between wealth and income, or the difference between wealth and income. People who are considered wealthy are able to spend a little bit more, sometimes beyond their income. If we're talking about you and me and our generation of income without wealth, we're limited with respect to spending to that income plus whatever access to credit we have. And so the more we take out in terms of credit, the more those payments back to credit are going to be. And so as we continue to deficit spend or spend beyond our means, it's going to take a larger and larger chunk of our income to pay that back.
What does the future hold if we don't start living within our means?
From a micro perspective, we're going to continue to spend more of our income on paying back old consumption. So if we use our credit cards, if we borrow against our house, we're going to take more of our income to paying that back. And we're going to be able to, or we're going to lose the ability to engage in purchasing consumption in the present. So we're going to be paying off our credit cards to a greater degree than what we are now. Or we're going to have to constantly try and strive for that higher wage. So we're going to have to look for that better job, that higher paying job, which may or may not be out there. Eventually we'll learn from an individual perspective, from an individual basis. But when we've had access to credit for so long, and it's really inexpensive right now, it's really cheap to borrow. There's really no negatives in the system, no sanctions in the system. other than that, the really high interest rates with respect to credit card debt. And so in the long run, I don't know. I mean, we might end up imploding on ourselves. With respect to the macro view, you've heard a lot of talk, particularly this election cycle, about the national debt and the national debt getting higher and higher and higher. There is a point where too much is too much, but what is that level? We don't know, and we won't know until we actually reach it. Right now, our level of national debt is probably 108% of our real GDP value, our annual real GDP value. But if you look at countries like Japan, they have national debt equivalent to 200%. Now, their economy has been depressed for a while, but they're still around. They're still manufacturing, making products. They're still borrowing money out there, and they're making investments. So what can we handle? I don't know. Time will tell.
What can we do in the future to be within our means economically?
What we're going to need to do, I have a couple of different views on this, so I'm going to try and see if I can address that question incrementally. One, as individuals, we need to be more disciplined in what we buy. We need to rely less on credit card debt. We need to rely less on sources of debt that we can use to buy current goods and services. So we need to be more disciplined. That's what it's going to take. So use the credit card not to constantly buy, and then pay the minimum payment. Use the credit card, though, instead to make current purchases and then have the cash flow to pay those back, or have the income to pay that back.
Right.
Instantly, right away, exactly. That's what we can do as individuals. From a macro perspective, we are a consumption-based economy, consumption-based society. So real GDP, our economic growth, is driven by our behavior, our consumer behavior, buying stuff, buying houses and cars and wash machines and food and all of that stuff. We're a consumer-based economy. What we need to do is step away from that, reduce the impact that consumers can have on our economy, because the last recession was primarily consumer-driven. And so when consumers stop spending, you can feel it. You can feel it in the economy. Stock market goes down. The housing market collapsed. And there are other reasons why that happened. But what we need to do from a macro perspective is focus on this component of economic growth called gross private domestic investment. We need to invest more in our future manufacturing capacity and have that drive our economy rather than consumers. Does that make sense? And so if we step away from consumption and focus on gross private domestic investment, we're investing in research and development, innovation, and we're creating the mechanism in the short run to fuel consumption in the long run.
Wow. If
we can balance it out.
In the past, weren't we more of a non-consumer based economy? During the Industrial Revolution, we were predominantly driven by manufacturing, by capital, so building buildings, factories, equipment, etc., etc. And now we've produced to capacity essentially our infrastructure, and now we're a service-based economy, and so we've stepped away from manufacturing, and we're predominantly doctors and lawyers and hospitals and haircut places and fast food restaurants, hotels. So we're essentially creating the mechanisms now for our consumption, rather than contributing to this future vehicle for economic growth.
So what would you, what kind of advice would you give to somebody who doesn't have credit card debt or anything? I mean, should they continue to try and be without a credit card, or maybe open a lineup for emergencies, or
if we're well, and that brings up a different issue entirely. If we're young people, if we're 18, 19, 20, we have a hard time building what we call our credit score, our credit history. And so if we can be disciplined with the use of credit cards, I would argue that it's good, because opening those credit cards helps us build that credit history. Anytime we borrow money, financial aid, and we're good at paying that back, and we make the monthly required payments, that adds to our credit history. But it's that discipline aspect too. It's that controlling our whims. Consumers are very whimsical. If we see something we want, we get it now, rather than saving it up. And that's what got us in trouble really with the real estate crisis. We no longer put 20% down on a house. There were mechanisms in place that allowed us to put down 5% or nothing. We got a mortgage for, yeah. And so that led to our eventual destruction, our eventual collapse. And we're recovering from that now.
I've also heard rumors that there was the housing bubble that burst.
Yep, housing bubble.
Now they're talking about the housing bubble was when the real estate market crashed.
Oh.
Is when everybody had these subprime mortgage loans.
Subprime mortgages.
And then it ended up everybody folding on them, and that's what pretty much contributed to getting us in this position we're in now.
Yep.
But I've also heard talk about the educational bubble.
Okay, so this notion of bubble economies, you see gold prices. Gold has gone way up, so gold is now $1,750 an ounce, and it has basically it's increased tenfold over the last 10 years. That's a bubble market. The price of education is becoming more expensive, and so people are trying to get loans to fund their education. Well, when we borrow funds, someone else gives us the money, and in the long run, they're expecting us to pay that back. That's an income stream for them, and so as we borrow more, you might see the prices, the interest rate that people use to pay back, plus interest. So that reimbursement, that could go up in the future.